Hi and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature. We're looking at this novel, Nervous Conditions. So we begin to wind up the study of the novel, and we're looking at the way in which Dangarembga really goes through a series of issues and foregrounds a series of issues, primarily the relationship between space, identity, gender, trauma, and of course textuality. So how is storytelling also part of the process of representation? And we spent a lot of time in the last couple of sessions looking at the way in which the gendering of space in a way becomes reflective of the deep-seated gendering which happens in the social relations in this particular setting, in this particular context. So we'll just continue from that point, and we'll begin to wind up the study of this novel, in which we're also examining how the entire process of forming God, or sort of the godliness, is essentially a masculine performance or masculine performance condition, right, through which the process of godliness is produced and perpetuated. And of course, the character of Bhabha, the uncle figure, is this patriarch of the family. He represents that the constructed quality of godliness, and unsurprisingly, he also occupies a central position in the house. And we looked at how certain spaces which are traditionally gendered as female are left relegated and abundant and windowless, and that again becomes quite symbolic. The broken pane in the kitchen, for example, becomes symbolic of the neglected, abundant condition of the woman in a society such as this. So we'll just continue in that tradition from this point. This should be on your screen, the final paragraph of this page. Dangarembga's interest in space and her parody of Bhabha as a deity implicate and also query the status of both Western European imperialism and the Europeans themselves as providence. So we saw how even the school space, the Sacred Heart school space, becomes very much a discursive space where the politics of privilege operate in quite explicit ways. So even that school, which is supposed to liberate the colonized child, just ends up being a perpetuation of different kinds of political privilege, right? So the black children are left relegated and abandoned in one corner, whereas the settlers, the white settlers' children, they are given priority. So on one hand, there's this diagram of diversity which the school is trying to project, but on the other hand, there are these deep-seated politics of privilege and discrimination which are being mapped, again, in very special settings and very special coordinates. Okay, so the novel veils this dialectic that Bhabha as God makes things, or so he claims. He himself, a blank native space, is educated / civilized, and hence made or cultivated in the way that land is. So we did notice this before as well, how the idea of plot becomes a double metaphor over here. Plot, of course, means the sort of the agricultural land through which one can be cultivated. I mean, a crop can be cultivated, but a crop is also a narrative, or that symbolic space in which the subject can be cultivated and become something else. So that convergence of these two metaphors take place in the section where we have Tambu trying to bring up a crop which can then be sold as a harvest, and then that will pay for education, and that how becomes almost a discursive battle, a discursive point of conflict, where the brother comes and takes the crops away and sells it off, leaving her with sort of cashless and agencyless, and how she has to recover that, right, in different ways. So the space, the land, agriculture, harvest, all these become very metaphoric in this novel. And the whole idea of the cultivated man becomes interesting in a colonial setting, because cultivation, of course, is a way of bringing up a certain crop, but it's also in a way bringing up a certain sense of self and projecting that in the social discursive world. Okay, so he made himself in the way the land is by the Trinitarian agencies, the Western European imperialism, namely education, religion, and material progress. So this is the Trinitarian engines, shall we say, the triple engines through which progress, and the whole idea of cultivation, the whole idea of agency are operated and marked. Education, religion, and material progress. You get educated, you become converted to religion, and of course that leads on, or that extends onto some kind of a material prosperity, which is connected again to the idea of self and agency, the privileged self and agency. Western European imperialism then, and Europeans for the matter, are godlike, or in Tambu's mockery, minor deities. European imperialists scrambled for Africa because they pictured most of the continent as vacant, a vacant space, legally res nullius, no man's land. Right? So the whole idea of this being a vacant space, an empty space where meanings can be projected, cultures can be projected, religions can be projected, language can be projected, becomes a part of the very ancient fantasy of imperialism. So if you just go back to the Robinson Crusoe story as well, there too we have this vacant space which is just waiting to be territorialized by the Western man, by the Western masculine fantasy of territorialization. And of course, it doesn't end there, because even the black body becomes a space that can be, territorialized and given a name to. So if you remember your Robinson Crusoe, the savage, the quote-unquote savage or the native of the island, is, someone who's rescued by Crusoe and given a name, Friday, given a religion, given an identity, given a self. Of course, that again, the agency is completely controlled by the imperialists. So the whole idea of the African space as something to be controlled, territorialized, projected, becomes part of the ancient archetypal imperial fantasy, which this novel also sort of mocks and perhaps deconstructs a little bit. So for them, as Marimba Annie put it, this place of Africa was nothing before we came here. All by ourselves, we made Africa from void, from the heart and nothingness of its Conradian darkness. So there's a reference to Joseph Conrad's novel. Africa is seen as a heart of darkness, as something which is just there, waiting to be enlightened, waiting to be territorialized, waiting to be controlled, waiting to be civilized. And this assumption of blankness, this assumption of darkness is, of course, part of the, European racist imaginary, where, just assume that a non-white is ignorant or uncultured or uneducated or uncivilized, and it's the holy mission to go and educate that land. So, and that also, in a way, sanctions imperialism, that justifies or legitimizes the whole machine of imperialism. So the narrative implies what manner of god are Baba Mukuro for the woman in the house and life, and imperialism, colonization for the Shona. So for the Shona tribe, there is that god of the colonial empire, the colonial presence, that becomes a god of liberation, emancipation, supposed liberation, emancipation. And Baba Mukuro is supposed to be the god in the house. But both are seen as constructed gods, which are to be lampooned to a large extent. And that lampooning of the authoritarian figures makes this novel a profoundly subversive novel, which is so deconstructive in quality, and sometimes often a parodic in quality, right? Is he really a bad man, considering the good things Baba Mukuro made for his Sigawaka family in Europe, for the African continent? So there is that ambivalence about who is a good man and who's a bad man. So is European imperialism good for Africa, or is it just a process of exploitation masquerading as a missionary machine, right? So that debate is an open-ended debate in this novel. So Nervous Conditions responds deconstructively. It articulates that the historiography of Shona African women's encounter with colonization, both European and the indigenous types, and as posited by outsiders who come from positions of unfamiliarity, inexperience, and assumed authority must be challenged thoroughly, as Tambu does. Namos, right? So Namo, of course, is a brother, the male figure, who is a privileged insider, but his authority is constantly questioned and challenged by Tambu, and that challenging of authority becomes part of the deconstructive narrative of this novel. By sharing similar temporal and mental spaces with the other victims of Baba Mukuro's similar temporal spaces of the other victims of Baba Mukuro ruined colonization, by sharing the unifying conditions of femaleness, as Tambu does with Nyasha, Maiguru, Lucia, and Mayanene, the representer corrects falsities sold as facts by operating from within. So this is very much an insider's critique, this novel. Insider's critique of patriarchy, an insider's critique of colonization, an insider's critique of the narrative of liberation, emancipation, and protection, which both the colonizer as well as the patriarch, the indigenous native patriarch, seem to assume, or seem to assert. She understands through eyewitnessing, personal encounter, and intellectual interrogation that men and imperialism, which play providence in and from historically protected spaces of power and privilege, make untrue and ludicrous claims, right? So the claims to support, the claims to emancipate, the claims to control are essentially, part of the territorializing mechanism of man. So at the end of it all, there's patriarchy. So whether it's colonialism or the person who's an 80% controlling the house, both are supported by patriarchy, a deep-seated patriarchy, which is the grand narrative. Right. When weighed, imperialism/colonization with the missionaries' purported altruism and Bhabha Mukuru's benefaction turns out to be overall a perversion of virtuousness. So these become masquerading missions, whitewashing missions. These are actually very evil enterprises, but they have this facet of benevolence and generosity. But actually what they want to do is control identity, control the subject, the female subject in particular in this novel. As does the white potato, whose taste made everything else in Maiguru's cooking taste funny. This civilization diffuses what Ngugi wa Thiong calls a cultural bomb that shatters the mental universe of the colonized. So the white potato in the novel is a metaphor which makes everything else funny. And so that's a bit of an outsider. That's something which is brought into the space and added. And that becomes a perversion of their culture. That becomes an attack, an invasion of their culture. And that sense of being invaded keeps happening all the time, even the domestic spaces where men just barge in the rooms without knocking, without taking any permission. So the white potato also becomes the metonymic symbol of imperialism. The colonizers bring it, and you start adding it everywhere, but it makes everything taste funny. And it becomes an act of diffusion. And Ngugi wa Thiong's idea of the cultural bomb becomes interesting over here, because that is defined as something which shatters the mental universe of the colonized. So the erstwhile culture of the colonized, the sense of agency, sense of cultural location is completely dislocated and deterritorialized to a large extent. In line with the same issue, Walter Rodney contends that providential colonialism also handed Africa a gift/legacy of oppression, exploitation, and underdevelopment as it pertains especially to a life-sustaining cornerstone of African/Shona society, a woman, right? So that women become the ultimate victims of any kind of oppression. That's something which keeps coming up in a novel. So they are the sites of trauma. They become the sites of contestation. They become the sites of violence to a large extent, right? And that's something which you see already happening, I mean, across different kinds of cultural settings, in the partition setting, which we just did, and also theoretically. Okay. To further question Bhabha Mukuru's deital exaltation and his spatial dogmas, Tambi relays various incidents calculated narratively to undermine his authority and thereby humanize him by exposing the sheer absurdity of his hegemonic claims. Right, so that the claim to authority, the claim to absolute control is sort of lampooned by humanizing him, and that act of humanizing, by making him fallible, by making him appear fallible just like everyone else is, and that undermines his presupposed authority, presupposed patriarchal authority. Besides uncovering the structural and aesthetic impairment in Bhabha Mukuru's house, Tambi reveals why the antiseptic sterility which her aunt and uncle strove for in the house could not be attained beyond a cursory level. Tambi knows full well, going by the homestead experience, that a dirtless house, a space with its implications of power, exclusion, control, order, and innocence, is unachievable because living is dirty. So again, the question of hygiene becomes important over here, in the sense that the obsession with hygiene, the obsession with cleanliness, becomes part of the imperial project of sanitization, and that of course undercuts the entire reality of life, which is a very messy, dirty enterprise. And that acknowledgement of reality, the acknowledgement of messiness, becomes in a way a subversive sentiment. As Toni Morrison also dramatizes compellingly in Sula, life is full of the good, the bad, and everything in between and beyond them, all of which coexist inextricably. Things are too complicated and interactive to be so sterilized. Tambi makes that case in her argument against Maiguru's idea that tea strainer, and by extension tea straining, are vital to tea making, that tea wouldn't be drinkable without it. It would all be tea leaves. Wright, commenting on the scene, writes that Dangarembga uses a tea strainer as a symbolic instrument that filters out Africa to produce a more authentic English flavor, right? So the tea strainer becomes a symbolic machine over here, and that in a way sanitizes the drink, makes the drink into some kind of an English beverage. The irony being that tea is, it's never grown in England. I mean, tea cannot be grown in England. So the entirety of the English obsession with tea is again part of the imperial fantasy. It has to be brought from somewhere else. However, before the Englishman can drink it, it has to be sanitized by a strainer. So that strainer, the little domestic kitchen culinary instrument, it becomes the marker of the fantasy of sterilization or sanitization, which is part of the bigger, broader imperial project. So we can see how little objects, little materials, very metonymic markers, they become reflectors of the broader obsession at a discursive political level. Authenticating indirectly Tambu's case against human purification, the buses that passed through the mission according to an almost regular schedule rolled up a storm of fine red dust which perversely settled in corners and on surfaces of rooms and armchairs and bookshelves, reminding you, Tambu says, that this was not heaven. So the dustiness, in a way, the viscerality of dustiness and dirt, that reminds you that this is not a sanitized heaven that the imperial project would fantasize to produce, or even the patriarchal project in the house would fantasize to produce. So the acknowledgement and articulation of messiness and dirt, and the fact that lived reality is dirty, messy, complicated, unpredictable. So all these acknowledgements become part of the mental frameworks, the mental structures through which authority is constantly questioned. Right. As does the Mammy Wagon, named cynically God's Case No Appeal, and Achebe is no longer at ease. So again, this is a reference to Achebe's novel No Longer at Ease, although we're not reading it in details. I do recommend that you do look it up, especially if you're reading Nervous Conditions. So the buses in Nervous Conditions become talking characters of sorts. They figure, one might say, as a collective voice of the dispossessed lower class and struggling shonas, some of whom we meet journey early in the novel. So the buses, the messy, dirty buses, become reflective of the unhappy citizens, the unhappy subjects, people who are sort of treated in a very oppressed way, treated in a very discriminatory way. So the buses, the dirty, messy buses, the dusty buses become very interesting symbols of the talking characters, the lesser mortals, quote unquote, the lesser mortals and this big grand enterprise of imperialism. So they represent the dispossessed, the lower class, the struggling shonas, the people who have been deprived of their moral rights, political rights, and agentic rights. Okay. Using red dust as symbolic expression of mass contrariness, this speakerly bus and its passengers mockingly defile the sacredness and authority of whiteness and the idea of flawless heaven. Right. So the red buses, they are full of dust, which produce a cloud of dust. In a way, it defiles the supposed superiority of the white project. The whiteness and the flawlessness of the white heaven has been constantly made dirty, constantly made muddy, constantly being made messy by this little buses which go up and down, filled with people who are unhappy, filled with people who are struggling, filled with people who are lower class and dispossessed, and the whole idea of the lesser lives, right? So these are people who travel in these buses, the lesser people, the lesser mortals, because these are not the privileged people. The privileged people drive cars in this setting. But this journeying, this constant intrusion of the buses throughout the novel, it becomes a reminder, which is almost a political reminder of the dispossessed people, the vast majority of people who are dispossessed and exploited in the novel. They indict, as well Western education, the affectations of middle-class existence and Bhabha Mukuru's position as a white man's mimic. To invoke Homi Bhabha, he's almost the same as a white man, but not quite, right? So, this reference to Bhabha is important over here, because some of you know Homi Bhabha has this wonderful and very complex theory of mimicry in the colonial space, and that theory is, the white person, the colonizer, and I'm using the word he quite deliberately over here, he introduces a certain kind of persona which is being mimicked by the colonized, right? So the colonized aspires to become the colonizer. The colonized aspires to appropriate the colonizer, and in the process produce a mimicry of that identity. Now that mimicry is never quite an authentic mimicry. The mimicry either falls short or exceeds the limit. So it's never quite there. So almost the same, but not quite. And this gap between the mimicked and the original identity, the gap can produce potential subversion. The gap can produce potential sites of subversion, right? So it's a very interesting theory, and I do recommend to look it up. It's a book called Location of Culture, where Bhabha talks about this in great details. Okay, in addition to the derisive public voice, the unexpected insurgencies of the novels Disenchanted Woman, from Nyasha and My Guru to Tambu's and Lucia's, would also disrupt in varying degrees Bhabha Mukuru's authority. Nyasha's unceasing defiance of Bhabha Mukuru's power, for which expectedly she pays a physical and emotional price, and her mother's brief and public abandonment of him, are emphatic statements of African woman's resistance. They are sacrilegious, aimed at unmasking further Bhabha Mukuru's socially constructed divinity and all it means. So again, the socially constructed, socially engineered idea of divinity, the design of divinity, something which is questioned by different acts, the bigger acts, also the micro acts of rebellion. Bhabha Mukuru never believes his daughter would hit him back when he beats her, and she does. And this is page 114 and 15. He never imagines his exploited and effaced wife, My Guru, would leave him even if briefly, in daylight and a public bus, the textual agency of mass discontent, and she does. So again, we can see how the bus becomes also the vehicle to enact agency for the disenfranchised, for the dispossessed, the people of lesser agencies. The bus becomes the vehicle through which agency can be enacted in a public space, right? It's a traveling bus. So the woman, My Guru, leaves Bhabha Mukuru in a bus, in one of those little crowded, dusty buses. Again, that becomes almost a signifier of agency, in other words, very, very authoritative and authoritarian setting. Okay, she does this in a Shona society that views such a public disagreement with or desertion of husband as a serious act of insubordination to the man, right? So the man is not to be questioned. The man is a grand patriarch whose authority is never questioned, can never be questioned, and yet we have someone like My Guru who leaves Bhabha Mukuru in one of those little buses. So again, the symbolism of the bus becomes important. It's a red bus as well. So again, that makes it, that redness, the dustiness, the viscerality of the bus makes it hit against the sanitized, clean project of masculinity, patriarchy, and imperialism. In like manner, Bhabha Mukuru never assumes that Tambu, whom he is civilizing, would defy his commandment that she attend her parents' forced remarriage. She too does and accepts the punishment as payment for her selfhood and voice. Worse still, Lucia, Tambu's aunt, whom Deepika Bahari calls an unmanageable free spirit, transgresses the Siguraka family patriarchy, and the added fact that the whites at the Young Ladies' College of the Sacred Heart carelessly mispronounce Bhabha Mukuru's family name as Siga Oke reduces him racially to a generic black-skinned male. Right, so we have different acts of mockery which mock Bhabha Mukuru's moral authority, patriarchal authority, and also in some sense linguistic authority, because his very name, his very family name, is mocked and mispronounced, perhaps inadvertently. But that also becomes, in a sense, public humiliation, public decimation of his authority, and that becomes part of the transgression package. There are different kinds of transgression over here. We have women leaving their husbands, we have women defying the choices made by the men, and we have these strong men whose names are mispronounced in the public space, right? So all these become little acts of rebellion and insubordination, which sort of deconstruct and undercut any presupposed patriarchal authority. So nervous conditions points out that where African women's lives are confined in suffocating social or familial space, or their own rightful and affirmative spaces are assaulted, it will be hard for society at large and the dominating males particularly to have a restful mind or maintain a spotless home, no matter its size and beauty. This is why Tambu, who refuses to be seduced by it, demystifies Bhabha Mukuru's house from palace, mansion, castle, and heaven to simply that, a house, right? So again, the choice of language becomes interesting over here. So the fact that Tanpuri doesn't call it a palace or a mansion or a castle and just simply calls it a house becomes a refusal to acknowledge authority, refusal to acknowledge the superiority of the particular space. Now, if you contrast that to what happens in Pride and Prejudice, where Elizabeth Bennet, who is otherwise such an intelligent person, intelligent, free-willed person, the white woman, but the moment she sees Pemberley, that is Darcy's house, the grand mansion, the grand estate, she's seduced by it, and she absolutely falls for it, and she gives her agency up to be someone who's situated in that estate, and that becomes an act of compromise, right? So you have an entirely different thing happens over here. We have a big house over here, reduced to a small site, whereas in Jane Austen's novel, which is actually some kind of a satire on marriage, I would say. We have a very strong, intelligent, free-willed woman who sort of falls for a big property, and that's actually a tragedy from a feminist perspective. Okay. So he himself is no more than a man, in fact a delimiting, distant and destructive divinity. This destructiveness is reinforced in his house's damaged and damaging attributes and in his severance of the household's familial, spiritual and gender bond. In his capacity as God in heaven up there, Bhabha Mukuru is not close to the pulse of females in his household down there. Right? So there is a distance over here between him who's up there as a God and the woman who are down there supposedly as lesser mortals. He operates from an otherworldly space, different and distant from the earthly realities of female experience. While he shares physically the same domestic space with a woman, we are told that he could detect alcohol on your breath at 5 yards in a strong wind. He is not in touch emotionally and spiritually with the inner plight and life. Little wonder then Bhabha Mukuru feels out of place in a feminine space, the dressmaker's shop in Sakuva township. Again, a very small space where the multitasking woman dressmaker, as does my guru with the mission house kitchen, manages to keep the clothes clean, the patterns together, even with the shop's spatial and other constraints. So that dressmaker's shop in the township of Sakuka again becomes a symbolic site, which is controlled by the woman, owned by a woman, managed by a woman, mapped by the woman, and that is a space where Bhabha Mukuru feels very inadequate. He feels like a complete misfit. So we have a woman claiming public space, claiming a profession, or claiming a public space through a profession, and it's that kind of a space where a man feels absolutely out of space, out of place, quite literally out of place. So deterritorialized. His authority is deterritorialized. His authority is deconstructed. Again, a very symbolic scene. Little wonder he, the omniscient, fails to know and to see his daughter Nyasha's rapidly worsening health, but instead misjudges it as not so serious. What she needs, he concludes, is to rest. Right. So again, this is a typical, masculinist medical strategy to sort of confine the woman into a room, make her rest. So this is part of the rest cure strategy that some doctors follow even in Europe in their treatment of quote unquote hysteric women. Right, so women were seen as hysterics. So any woman disease, any female disease, that's kind of sexism which was rampant in the 19th and 20th century. Hysteria was seen as a female malady. So any woman's disease was seen as something which required male protection, male surveillance. So rest cure was a very important, was very common practice in the treatment of female hysterics. So a similar kind of an appropriation of that kind of medical vocabulary here as well. So when Nyasha, who is Bhabha Mukuru's daughter, who has a sort of failing health, Bhabha Mukuru just simply says she needs to rest, and that's enough for her to be to convalesce. Right. So that again is part of the patriarchal principle of control, surveillance, and coercion. Right, so Bhabha Mukuru's persistent steadiness as his daughter's health declines deepens his human and ideological flaws. However, in tandem with the novel's disinterest in narrowness and one-dimensionality, he is depicted not as a total monster, but rather as a pitiable confluence of competing historical inheritances. right? So we can see how it's easy to make someone like him as a monster, but then that's not something that Dangarembga does. And there is a definite degree of humanization which happens over here. And that humanization, obviously, it makes a novel more complex in quality. And that's something which makes the entire discursive strategy of Dangarembga so relatable. So if Bhabha Mukuru became a complete monster, then obviously the whole thing would have become just a black and white thing. But of course, it's not like that. There's a lot of grayness around the novel, and even the characters in the novel who assume positions of authority become sort of pitiable to a certain extent, and that pitiable quality makes us able to empathize with them in different degrees, right? So if it's any indication, Nyasha's anguished comment is not altogether her father's fault, in that they, or England, did it specially to him. They put him through it all, turning him into a good boy, a good munt, a bloody good kafir, right? So again, this Anglicization, the English education, is seen as something which is a destructive element in Bhabha Mukuru, which makes him more patriarchal, which makes him more oppressive, which makes him more of a tyrant. So that equation between imperialism and patriarchy is done here as well. Then it makes sense, the argument that he's as much a victimizer as he's a victim of warring cultural institutions, right? So, in enacting patriarchy, he also becomes a victim of patriarchy, because he knows, he doesn't know, that he's enacting a very tyrannical, oppressive model of coercion, of control, of territorialization. So in doing that, he's also a victim, because he thinks he's being benevolent, but then it's just the opposite effect on the people around him, right? So that ambivalence is obviously there. So he's a product of his time, consistent with how Naomi, before his death, was acting in the expected manner. Bhabha Mukuru is a man overwhelmed by the responsibilities his success entails. Sue Thomas says it best: Bhabha Mukuru's position is a difficult one. He is placed within and has to negotiate two systems of economic, political, and family regulation, the English and the Shona. So he's educated, he's appropriated the English education, the English culture. At the same time, he's a patriarch in the Shona culture. So he's this double bind through which he is almost imprisoned by the dictates of the discourse. So Dangarembga worries nonetheless that false yet despotic male divinities and spaces could emerge at the fortuitous convergence of the complications of one's position as family benefactor and the other elements that transform some of Africa's post-colonial elite into powerhouses and spaces. So, it just becomes a perpetuation of power. So, the post-colonial elite just becomes a new colonizer. So the patriarch becomes a new colonizer. So that is the worry in the novel. That is the concern in the novel, that the power structures keep getting perpetuated and replicated. And the victims end up always being the woman. And that is a trauma. That's an intergenerational trauma. That's an intergenerational nervous conditions through which all these embodiments, all these identities are produced and perpetuated, right? So the elements include order of birth, privileged gender, pioneering education, professional hierarchy, marital position, parental rights, and economic benefaction. So all this becomes markers of privilege. When these forces interact unchecked, especially in a patriarchal culture, men become providence, the omnipotent, revered, feared, and incontrovertible shaper of human destiny, a god status that colonization assumed in its encounter with the native. This is an encounter that has left the latter, whose world is now permanently disrupted, with enduring tensions. So let's stop at this point today, but the enduring tensions, as you can see, the trauma over here, is very much a social trauma. It's very much this process of endless negotiation with patriarchy, with authority, and in terms of different forms of identity. And this claustrophobia, which is there in the house, which is there in the school, is also reflected in the bigger claustrophobia in the society, which has this enduring trauma, this enduring tensions, which are nervous in quality, which are neural in quality, and this neurotic quality of this discourse formation, this identity formation, is what makes this novel such a profoundly rich text, as well as a social commentary and a political commentary of racial identities around that time. So we stop at this point today, and the next session will wind up with nervous conditions. Thank you for your attention.